The spring air in Vienna carried the scent of blooming flowers and the weight of centuries of musical history. The Musikverein's Golden Hall stood proud as it had for over 150 years, its walls having witnessed the performances of legends. Today, it would host the International Vienna Piano Competition, an event that drew talented musicians from across the globe. Backstage, the air was thick with a mixture of expensive perfumes, anxiety, and ambition. 28 competitors from 16 countries sat in various states of preparation. Some paced nervously, others sat with eyes closed in meditation, and a few frantically practiced difficult passages on silent keyboards. In the corner, away from the others, sat Hiroko Tanaka. At 23, she was neither the youngest nor the oldest competitor, but perhaps the most overlooked. Her simple black dress lacked the flair of the other women's attire, and her straight black hair was pulled back in a practical bun rather than styled for the occasion. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. Unlike the others, Hiroko hadn't graduated from Juilliard or the Royal College of Music. She'd studied at the Osaka College of Music, a respectable institution, but not one that typically produced international stars. Her teacher had pushed her to enter this competition, convinced that her talent deserved a wider audience. Hiroko had agreed reluctantly, never having traveled outside of Japan before. The competition organizer, a tall Austrian woman with a clipboard and a perpetual frown, walked through the room. 15 minutes until we begin. Please check the performance order posted by the door. A flurry of movement followed her announcement as competitors rushed to see when they would perform. Hiroko remained seated. She already knew she was 12th just before the lunch break. Not an ideal spot. The judges would be hungry and distracted, but she accepted it without complaint. The backstage door opened, and heads turned as Viktor Kozlov entered. At 32, he was already a legend in the classical music world. The Russian pianist had won this very competition 10 years ago, launching a career that included performances with the world's finest orchestras and 7 Grammy Awards. This year, he had been invited to be a guest judge. Viktor moved through the room with the ease of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. His tailored black suit emphasized his tall, lean frame, and his dark hair was artfully tousled. A perpetual half-smile, some might call it a smirk, played on his lips as he nodded to a few competitors he recognized. His eyes scanned the room, assessing the competition. When his gaze fell on Hiroko, the smirk deepened slightly. She didn't fit the image of a world-class pianist. Too ordinary, too plain, too unremarkable. He moved on without a second glance. Hiroko noticed his dismissal, but showed no reaction. She had seen that look before, from teachers, from other students, from competition judges. That flash of assessment followed by dismissal. It no longer bothered her, or at least, that's what she told herself. The first competitor was called. A young man from Germany whose hands shook visibly as he walked past the others. The room fell silent as they all listened to the sounds from the stage. The polite applause as he entered, the momentary silence, then the first notes of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. One by one, the competitors left the waiting area. Some returned with tears of relief, others with tears of disappointment. The judges were tough this year, with Viktor being particularly harsh according to the whispers that circulated among those who had already performed. As number 12 approached, Hiroko finally moved. She stretched her fingers methodically and rolled her shoulders to release the tension. A young American woman returning from her performance gave Hiroko a sympathetic look. "He's brutal today," she whispered. "Stopped my performance halfway through to ask if I'd considered a different career." Hiroko nodded in thanks for the warning but said nothing. The organizer appeared at the door. "Tanaka Hiroko, you're next." Hiroko stood, smoothed her dress, and followed the woman through the winding corridors of the historic building. The polite applause for the previous competitor was just dying down as they reached the wings of the stage. "When I announce your name, walk to the center of the stage, bow, then proceed to the piano," the organizer instructed. Hiroko nodded, her face betraying no emotion. Inside, though, her heart pounded against her ribs. This was the moment she had practiced for since she was 4 years old, sitting at her grandmother's old upright piano in their small apartment in Osaka. Our next competitor is Tanaka Hiroko from Japan, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D minor. Hiroko walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. The Golden Hall was even more impressive from this vantage. 1,744 seats arranged in a horseshoe around the stage, with standing room for another 300. Today it was nearly full. The competition had a devoted following in Vienna, a city that took its musical heritage seriously. She bowed precisely, then walked to the magnificent Bosendorfer Imperial grand piano that dominated the stage. Its 9 extra keys in the bass register gave it a distinctive appearance, longer than standard concert grands. Hiroko adjusted the bench carefully, then placed her hands in her lap, taking one deep breath before positioning them over the keys. From his seat at the judges' table, Viktor Kozlov watched with that same smirk. Rachmaninoff's third was an ambitious choice, perhaps too ambitious. Many considered it the most technically challenging piano concerto ever written. Legendary pianist Josef Hoffmann, to whom Rachmaninoff had dedicated the piece, had never performed it publicly, claiming his hands were too small. What chance did this unremarkable woman from an unremarkable school have? In the front row, an elderly Japanese couple sat holding hands tightly. Hiroko's parents had spent their life savings on her musical education and this trip to Vienna. Her father, a factory worker who had never taken a vacation in 30 years, watched with nervous pride. Her mother, who had cleaned houses to pay for extra piano lessons, whispered a prayer. At the back of the hall stood Hiroko's teacher, Yukio Sato. At 76, he had never achieved the international career he'd once dreamed of, but in Hiroko, he had found the student who might. He had recognized her extraordinary talent when she was just 6 years old, and had devoted himself to nurturing it ever since. The room fell completely silent as Hiroko's fingers hovered above the keys. In competitions like this, first impressions were crucial. The opening of Rachmaninoff's third was deceptively simple, a quiet, melancholy melody that built gradually toward the piece's legendary complexities. Hiroko began to play. The first notes floated into the hall, perfectly balanced and hauntingly beautiful. There was something in her touch, a warmth, a sincerity, that made the familiar melody sound fresh. Several judges looked up from their notes, their attention caught. Victor's smirk faltered slightly. Her technique was flawless, but more than that, there was an interpretation here that he hadn't heard before, less showy than most, more thoughtful, finding new meaning in passages he thought he knew by heart. As Hiroko moved into the more technically demanding sections, her small hands moved with astonishing precision and speed. There was no hint of strain on her face, no dramatic gestures or expressions, just a quiet intensity that drew the audience in. In the fourth row, a music critic who had covered this competition for 20 years stopped writing notes and simply listened. He couldn't remember the last time he'd done that. By the time Hiroko reached the first movement's cadenza, a prolonged solo section of extreme difficulty, the atmosphere in the hall had changed. The usual shuffling, coughing, and program rustling had ceased entirely. All 2,000 people sat in rapt attention, collectively holding their breath as Hiroko's fingers flew across the keyboard with impossible speed and clarity. Victor's smirk had completely vanished. He leaned forward in his chair, eyes narrowed in concentration. How was she doing this? The piece was a monster, a mountain that had defeated countless talented pianists, and yet she climbed it with an ease that seemed almost casual. As the first movement ended, there was a moment of stunned silence before the audience burst into applause, a breach of competition etiquette, as applause was typically reserved for the end of the entire piece. The judges made no move to stop it. Even they seemed to need this moment to process what they had just witnessed. Hiroko remained still, her hands in her lap, her face composed. Only the slight rise and fall of her shoulders indicated the physical exertion she had just undertaken. She waited for the applause to die down before positioning her hands to begin the second movement. Viktor Kozlov, renowned pianist and harsh, critic found himself in an unfamiliar position, that of a humbled listener. The smirk that had seemed permanently affixed to his face was gone, replaced by an expression of genuine wonder. As Hiroko began to play again, he realized he was witnessing something he had thought no longer possible in his jaded world, the discovery of a truly original voice in classical music. And for the first time in many years, he felt the pure, childlike joy of being surprised by beauty. The second movement of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto began with a gentleness that belied the storm of the first. Hiroko's fingers caressed the keys with such tenderness that several audience members leaned forward, straining to catch every nuance. In this quiet passage, her gift shone even brighter. Anyone could play loudly and quickly with enough practice, but this delicate control, this was the mark of a true artist. Viktor Kozlov had recovered somewhat from his initial shock. He had heard thousands of pianists in his career. Many were technically proficient, some were even brilliant. But there was something different about this woman's playing that he couldn't quite define. It wasn't just her technique, though that was extraordinary. It wasn't just her interpretation, though it was refreshingly original. There was something else. Something that made him feel as though he were hearing this familiar piece for the first time. The other judges seemed equally affected. Helena Voigt, a German pianist known for her precise academic approach to music, had set down her pen entirely. Yuri Petrov, the oldest judge and a direct musical descendant of the Russian piano school that had produced Rachmaninoff himself, had tears in his eyes. In the audience, Hiroko's parents sat motionless, barely breathing. They had sacrificed everything for their daughter's musical education, but even they had never heard her play quite like this. Her father, who had worked double shifts at the factory for years to pay for her lessons, felt a lump in his throat. Her mother, who had cleaned houses and taken in laundry to buy sheet music, gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. As the second movement flowed into the third without pause, Hiroko's posture changed slightly. The final movement was a test of endurance as much as skill. Nearly 10 minutes of some of the most demanding piano writing ever composed. Her small shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, her back straightened, and she took a slightly deeper breath. The music surged forward, building in complexity and intensity. Passages that would have left most pianists in despair flowed from Hiroko's fingers with apparent ease. Her hands sometimes crossed, sometimes leapt from one end of the keyboard to the other, all while maintaining perfect clarity and balance. Viktor found himself holding his breath during particularly difficult sections, only to release it in silent amazement when Hiroko navigated them flawlessly. The smirk that had seemed a permanent fixture on his face was long gone, replaced by an expression of genuine wonder. He had come to this competition expecting to be bored, to find perhaps one or two pianists of moderate interest. Instead, he was witnessing something he had thought impossible, a completely new voice in an art form hundreds of years old. In the back of the hall, Hiroko's teacher, Yukio Sato, stood with tears streaming down his wrinkled face. He had known she was special from the moment she first sat at his piano as a 6-year-old. He had taught her everything he knew, and then watched as she surpassed him. This performance was his legacy as much as it was her triumph. As Hiroko approached the concerto's legendary coda, a passage of such difficulty that many pianists simplified it in performance, the entire hall seemed to collectively hold its breath. Would she attempt the original version with its massive chords and lightning-fast octave runs? The answer came seconds later as her hands became a blur of motion. Not only was she playing Rachmaninoff's original notation, but she was playing it with a freedom and power that made it sound spontaneous, as though she were composing it on the spot rather than executing one of the most challenging passages in the piano repertoire. The final chords resonated through the golden hall, seeming to make the crystal chandeliers tremble. When the last note faded, there was a moment of complete silence, that magical instant when an audience is so moved they forget to applaud. Then, as if a dam had broken, the hall erupted. People leapt to their feet, some shouting "Bravo!" in a most un-Viennese display of enthusiasm. Even the other competitors watching from the wings or the back of the hall joined in the ovation. They knew better than anyone what they had just witnessed. At the judges' table, all 7 judges stood. As well, an unprecedented response. Viktor Kozlov found himself on his feet before he'd made a conscious decision to stand, his hands coming together in applause that was as much a recognition of his own humbling as it was appreciation for Hiroko's artistry. Hiroko herself seemed almost surprised by the response. She rose from the piano bench and gave a deep, formal bow, her face still composed. Only those closest to the stage might have noticed the slight trembling of her hands, the only outward sign of the enormous emotional and physical effort she had just expended. As she walked off stage, the applause continued. In the wings, the competition organizer stared at her with wide eyes. That was... "I've never..." she stammered, at a loss for words. Hiroko gave a small, polite smile and bowed. Slightly again. "Thank you," she said softly, the first words many had heard her speak. She made her way back to the competitors' waiting room, where an unusual silence fell as she entered. These were her rivals, each hoping to win the same prize she now seemed destined to claim. Yet one by one they approached her with congratulations. They were musicians before they were competitors, and what they had heard transcended rivalry. "How did you develop that left-hand technique?" asked a young man from South Korea. "The way you voiced the second theme in the first movement, I've never thought of interpreting it that way," said a woman from Italy. Hiroko answered their questions quietly, with none of the arrogance that often accompanied exceptional talent. She had been raised to believe that her gift was not hers alone, but something given to her to share with others. Meanwhile, the judges were in heated discussion. Normally, they would wait until all competitors had performed before deliberating, but Hiroko's playing had disrupted the usual protocol. "We should just end the competition now," said Yuri Petrov, only half joking. "Nothing we hear for the rest of the day will come close." "That would be unfair to the remaining competitors," Helena Voigt replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. "What did you think, Victor?" asked Chen Wei, the Chinese judge who had won this competition 15 years earlier. "You're unusually quiet." Victor was staring at his score sheet, where he had given Hiroko perfect marks in every category, something he had never done before. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have just been reminded why I became a pianist in the first place." The others looked at him in surprise. Viktor Kozlov was known for his technical brilliance and his ego in equal measure. To hear him speak with such humility was almost as shocking as Hiroko's performance. The competition continued after the lunch break, but as Yuri had predicted, none of the remaining performers could match what Hiroko had done. They played well, some even brilliantly, but the magic was missing. The audience, having experienced the extraordinary, could not be satisfied with the merely excellent. By the end of the day, the result was a foregone conclusion. The judges' deliberation, normally a lengthy affair with passionate arguments for different candidates, took less than 10 minutes. Hiroko Tanaka had won the International Vienna Piano Competition by unanimous decision, with the highest score in the competition's 65-year history. As the competitors gathered for the announcement, Victor found himself watching Hiroko. She stood slightly apart from the others, her hands clasped in front of her, her face showing no hint of the nervousness that marked the other finalists. Either she knew she had won, or, more intriguingly, she did not care about winning. When her name was announced, she stepped forward with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the competition. She accepted the crystal trophy and the envelope containing the prize money, 50,000 euros and a 3-year contract with Vienna's prestigious concert management agency. The audience applauded wildly again, many still on their feet. Critics in the crowd were already typing furiously on their phones, sending reports that would appear in tomorrow's papers around the world. A star had been born today, and they all knew it. As the ceremony concluded and people began to leave, Victor made his way through the crowd toward Hiroko. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say to her, only that he needed to say something. The smirk that had been his shield against the world was gone, replaced by an expression of genuine respect. Their paths would cross again, That much was certain. But in this moment, as he approached the unassuming woman who had just turned the classical music world upside down, Viktor Kozlov knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again for either of them. The reception following the competition was held in the Musikverein's elegant glass hall. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd of musicians, critics, and patrons of the arts who mingled with glasses of champagne. The room hummed with excited conversation, most of it centered on one topic: Hiroko Tanaka. She stood near a marble column, a small island of calm in the swirling social current. Her parents hovered nearby, overwhelmed by the opulence and attention. Her father, in his first suit bought specially for this trip, nodded politely as people approached. Her mother, in a simple but elegant dress that had been her best for 20 years, bowed slightly with each introduction. "You must be very proud," said a woman from the Vienna Philharmonic to Hiroko's parents, her German translated by a helpful bystander. "Yes," her father replied in careful English. "Very proud. She practiced and very hard." The simplicity of his statement brought tears to the eyes of the translator, who knew enough about music to understand the years of sacrifice those few words represented. Across the room, Viktor Kozlov watched the scene with newfound interest. He had attended countless receptions like this one, had been the center of attention at many of them, but tonight he was content to observe from the periphery, a flute of champagne untouched in his hand. He was particularly struck by Hiroko's demeanor. Most competition winners, himself included, had basked in their moment of triumph. Hiroko seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention, answering questions politely but briefly, deflecting praise with small smiles and modest nods. "Quite the discovery, isn't she?" said a voice beside him. Viktor turned to find Chen Wei, the Chinese judge who had won this competition before him. "Indeed," Viktor replied. "I wouldn't have expected it." Chen raised an eyebrow. "Because she's Japanese? Or because she's a woman?" Viktor frowned. "Neither, because she doesn't look like a star. No flash, no drama." "Ah," Chen nodded. "And yet, she has something more valuable than flash." "What's that?" "Soul," Chen said simply. "Something many of us lose along the way to success." The words stung as they were meant to. Viktor had been called many things in his career: brilliant, innovative, provocative, but soulful was not among them. His playing was technically perfect, exciting even, but critics had occasionally noted a certain emotional coolness, a distance between performer and music. Across the room, Hiroko excused herself from a conversation with a record executive and walked toward the large windows overlooking Vienna's illuminated streets. Viktor saw his opportunity. "Excuse me," he said to Chen, then made his way toward Hiroko. She was gazing out at the city lights, a faint reflection of her face visible in the glass. Vienna at night was magical, a city where Mozart and Beethoven had walked, where music seemed to rise from the very cobblestones. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Viktor said as he approached. Hiroko turned, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Yes," she agreed softly. "Very beautiful." Up close he could see the fatigue in her face. The competition had been demanding, and the emotional toll of such a performance was as draining as the physical one. "Your playing today was—" Viktor paused, searching for the right word. "Extraordinary." "Thank you," she said with a slight bow of her head. "I must confess I didn't expect it," he continued, then winced at how that sounded. "What I mean is, I understand." Hiroko interrupted gently. "I don't look like a concert pianist." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a statement of fact. Viktor found himself drawn to this lack of pretense. In his world of egos and rivalries, such straightforward honesty was refreshing. "Where did you study?" he asked, genuinely curious now. "Osaka College of Music, with Professor Yukio Sato." Viktor had never heard of either the school or the teacher. "And before that?" A small smile touched Hiroko's lips. "With my grandmother. She played in hotel lobbies." Viktor nearly choked on his champagne. Most elite pianists began with prestigious teachers, often at special schools for gifted children. A grandmother who played in lobbies was not the typical foundation for a career that would now, after today, undoubtedly reach the world's greatest concert halls. She must have been very good, he managed. She loved music, Hiroko replied. That was enough. There was something in her tone, not rebuke exactly, but perhaps a gentle correction, as if to say that loving music was more important than being very good at it. Before Victor could respond, they were interrupted by the competition organizer, who needed Hiroko for photographs with the judges and sponsors. She excused herself, with another small bow, leaving Victor with his thoughts. Across the room, Hiroko's teacher, Yukio Sato, watched the exchange with interest. He had recognized Victor immediately. Who in the classical music world wouldn't? He had also seen the famous pianist's expression during Hiroko's performance, the transformation from smug dismissal to stunned admiration. Yukio made his way slowly toward Victor, his aged legs protesting after standing for most of the day. At 76, he found these events increasingly taxing, but nothing would have kept him from being here for Hiroko's moment. "Mr. Kozlov," he said, extending a hand. "I am Yukio Sato, Hiroko's teacher." Victor shook the offered hand, noting the strength in the old man's grip despite his frail appearance. "Your student is remarkable," he said. Yukio nodded, accepting the compliment as his due. "I have taught for 52 years, many talented students, none like Hiroko." "What makes her different?" Victor asked, surprising himself with his eagerness to understand. Yukio considered the question, his gaze drifting to where Hiroko stood with the judges. Most pianists play with their hands, some with their heart. Hiroko plays with her soul. It was almost the same thing Chen had said. Victor felt a twinge of something unfamiliar, perhaps envy, but of a different sort than he was accustomed to. He had never envied another pianist's technique or fame, confident in his own abilities. But this quality that both Chen and Yukio had identified, this was something he wasn't sure he possessed. "Could you teach me that?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, and Victor immediately felt foolish. He, Victor Kozlov, asking for lessons from an unknown teacher from an obscure school? But Yukio didn't laugh. He studied Victor's face with keen eyes that missed nothing. "No," he said finally. "It cannot be taught. Only found." "How?" Victor pressed, forgetting his pride and his sudden hunger to understand. "By remembering why you first sat at the piano, before competitions, before fame." Yukio's voice was gentle but firm. "You know why. You have just forgotten." The old man bowed slightly and moved away, leaving Victor with a strange, hollow feeling in his chest. When had he last played for the pure joy of it? When had music become a vehicle for his ego rather than an end in itself? Across the room, Hiroko was being introduced to the director of the Vienna Philharmonic. Tomorrow, news of her triumph would be in music publications worldwide. Offers would pour in, recording contracts, concert tours, festival appearances. Her life was about to change dramatically. Victor knew this path well. He had walked it himself, had enjoyed its privileges and paid its prices. The constant travel, the pressure to deliver perfection night after night, the gradual isolation that came with being placed on a pedestal. Would it change her? Would that rare quality that made her playing so special survive the machinery of the classical music industry? He was surprised to find himself hoping it would. The reception continued around him, but Victor remained lost in thought. Tomorrow he would fly to New York for a concert at Carnegie Hall, then to Tokyo, then to Berlin. His schedule was booked solid for the next 2 years. Normally he found reassurance in this constant demand for his talent. Tonight it felt like a treadmill he couldn't step off. Hiroko and her parents were preparing to leave, their natural reserve making them eager to escape the crush of attention. Victor watched as she bowed one last time to the competition organizers, then turned toward the exit. On impulse, he moved to intercept her. "Miss Tanaka," he called. She paused, turning toward him with a questioning look. He faltered, unsure what he wanted to say. I would very much like to hear you play again someday. Hiroko studied him for a moment, then gave him the first genuine smile he had seen from her. I would like that too, Mr. Kozlov. With that, she and her parents left, leaving Victor with the strange sensation that something significant had just happened, though he couldn't have said exactly what it was. What he did know was that the smirk he had worn like armor for so many years felt foreign now, like a mask he had outgrown. And somewhere deep inside, a memory stirred, of a young boy sitting at a piano for the first time, filled with wonder at the magic of making music. 6 months passed like a whirlwind for Hiroko. The morning after the competition, she had awakened in her modest hotel room to find her phone overflowing with messages. Record labels, concert venues, festivals. Everyone wanted the young Japanese pianist who had taken Vienna by storm. Her parents had sat bewildered on the edge of the bed as she translated the offers. Her father, who had spent 30 years at the same factory, couldn't comprehend the sums being mentioned. Her mother kept touching Hiroko's hand, as if to make sure this wasn't a dream they would all wake from. Now, on a crisp autumn evening, Hiroko stood backstage at Carnegie Hall in New York City. Through a small gap in the curtains, she could see the sold-out auditorium. Nearly 3,000 people had come to hear her American debut. The pressure should have been overwhelming, but Hiroko felt strangely calm. The piano was the one place in the world where she felt completely at home. 5 minutes, Miss Tanaka, the stage manager said, clipboard in hand. Hiroko nodded, continuing her ritual of gentle hand stretches. She wore a simple black dress, elegantly cut but without flash or ornament. Her hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun. Some of her new advisors had suggested a more dramatic look. This was New York after all, but Hiroko had politely declined. She wanted nothing to distract from the music. Her program tonight was bold. Bach's Goldberg variations in the first half, Mussorgsky's Pictures at an exhibition in the second. Both were demanding works that required technical brilliance and deep, emotional understanding. Both were also typically performed by pianists with decades of experience, not newcomers making their Carnegie Hall debut. But Hiroko had insisted. These were pieces she loved, pieces that spoke to her soul. The Bach was mathematical perfection, imbued with humanity. The Mussorgsky was raw emotional power shaped by artistic discipline. Together, they represented everything she believed about music. As she waited, her mind drifted to the past 6 months. The contract with Vienna's most prestigious management agency had brought opportunities she had never imagined. She had played with the Berlin Philharmonic, the Amsterdam Concertgebouw, the London Symphony. Critics had called her a once-in-a-generation talent and the future of classical piano. Through it all, she had tried to maintain the quiet center her teacher had instilled in her. Success is more dangerous than failure, Yukio had warned before she left Japan. It can make you believe the applause is for you, not for the music coming through you. She had called him weakly, grounding herself in his wisdom as the world spun faster around her. He always asked the same question first. Are you still finding joy in the playing? As long as the answer was yes, he said, the path was true. The house lights dimmed, and the audience's murmur faded to expectant silence. Hiroko took one deep breath, centered herself, and walked onto the stage. The applause that greeted her was enthusiastic. Many had heard recordings of her competition performance, which had gone viral in classical music circles. She bowed deeply, then seated herself at the magnificent Steinway Concert Grand. As she placed her hands on the keys, she noticed something she hadn't seen from backstage. In the 4th row, center section, sat Victor Kozlov. Their paths hadn't crossed since Vienna, though she had heard he'd been asking about her performances. She hadn't expected him to come tonight. He was in the middle of his own North American tour, playing with the Chicago Symphony tomorrow, if she remembered correctly. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. The smirk was gone from his face, replaced by something like anticipation. Hiroko gave a small nod of acknowledgement, then turned her attention to the piano. The opening aria of the Goldberg Variations floated into the perfect acoustics of Carnegie Hall. The piece began simply, a beautiful melody that Bach would transform through 30 variations of increasing complexity before returning to its original unadorned form. From the first notes, the audience knew they were witnessing something special. Hiroko played with a clarity that made Bach's intricate counterpoint transparent, each voice distinct yet harmoniously integrated with the others. There was both mathematical precision and living warmth in her interpretation, as if the music written nearly 3 centuries ago was being created anew in this moment. In the fourth row, Viktor Kozlov leaned forward slightly. He had heard the Goldberg Variations hundreds of times, had played them himself to great acclaim. But Hiroko's interpretation was making him hear new things in this familiar work. Her tempos were unhurried but never dragging, allowing the music to breathe naturally. Her ornamentation was tasteful and historically informed, yet somehow personal. Most striking was her touch, that mysterious quality that separated merely excellent pianists from truly great ones. Each note seemed perfectly weighted, neither too heavy nor too light, creating a sound that was at once powerful and crystalline. As Hiroko moved through the variations, Viktor found himself forgetting to analyze her technique, something he habitually did when hearing other pianists. Instead, he was simply experiencing the music, being carried along by Bach's genius and Hiroko's profound understanding of it. When she reached the final area, returning to the simple theme after the journey through complexity, many in the audience had tears in their eyes. The theme was unchanged, yet after hearing all the variations, it seemed to contain all the emotional depth of the entire work within its simple lines. The silence that followed the last note was profound, that magical moment when an audience is so moved they forget to applaud. Then Carnegie Hall erupted in applause and cheers. People rose to their feet, some shouting, "Brava!" Viktor found himself standing too, clapping with genuine admiration. Hiroko bowed deeply, then left the stage for the intermission. The buzz in the hall during the break was electric. Critics who had come prepared to be skeptical were frantically revising their mental reviews. Audience members who had come out of curiosity were calling friends during intermission, telling them they were witnessing history. Backstage, Hiroko sipped water and did gentle stretches to keep her hands limber. The Mussorgsky that would follow was physically demanding, with massive chords and rapid passages that would test any pianist's stamina. But she felt strong, centered, connected to something larger than herself. When she returned to the stage, for the second half, the audience welcomed her with even greater enthusiasm. She acknowledged their applause with another deep bow, then settled at the piano for pictures at an exhibition. This piece was programmatic music at its finest, a musical depiction of a walk through an art exhibition, with each movement representing a different painting. It required not just technique but imagination, the ability to conjure images and emotions through sound alone. From the opening promenade, depicting the viewer walking through the gallery, Hiroko transported the audience into Mussorgsky's world. Each musical picture was vividly characterized: the lumbering bidwo with its ox cart, the delicate ballet of the unhatched chicks, the majestic Great Gate of Kiev that concluded the work. Viktor was mesmerized. He had always admired this piece for its pianistic challenges, but tonight he was seeing the actual pictures in his mind, feeling the emotions Mussorgsky had intended to evoke. Hiroko was not just playing notes, she was telling a story, painting, with sound. As she reached the thunderous final pages of the Great Gate of Kiev, Carnegie Hall seemed to vibrate with the sound. The grand piano responded to her touch with rich, organ-like sonorities that filled every corner of the famous venue. The audience held its collective breath as she shaped the final chords, building to a conclusion of awe-inspiring grandeur. When the last chord faded, there was another moment of stunned silence. Then the audience was on its feet, applauding with an intensity rarely seen even in this hall that had hosted the greatest musicians of the past century. The ovation continued as Hiroko returned for bow after bow, the audience unwilling to let the evening end. After her fifth return to the stage, Hiroko raised her hand slightly to quiet the audience. They settled immediately, eager to hear what she might play as an encore. She returned to the piano, and to everyone's surprise, began a simple Japanese folk song, a lullaby her grandmother had taught her when she was a child. After the technical fireworks of the Mussorgsky, its unadorned beauty brought tears to many eyes. It was as if, having shown her mastery of the Western classical canon, she was offering a piece of her heart, her roots, her true self. In the fourth row, Viktor Kozlov felt something shift inside him. The cynicism that had been his companion for so many years seemed to be melting away, replaced by a forgotten feeling, the pure love of music that had drawn him to the piano as a child. As the tender melody filled the hall, he made a decision. When the concert ended, he would go backstage, not to offer professional advice or connections as he might have done before, but to thank her for reminding him why music mattered, for showing him what he had lost, and perhaps, if he was brave enough, to ask if she might help him find it again. Backstage at Carnegie Hall was a flurry of activity. Well-wishers, music executives, and critics crowded the green room, all hoping for a moment with the evening star. Hiroko stood in the center of it all, accepting congratulations with quiet grace. Despite the clamor around her, she maintained that same centered calm that had marked her playing. Viktor hesitated at the edge of the crowd. In the past, he would have walked straight through, confident in his status and the deference it commanded. Tonight, he felt strangely uncertain. He watched as Hiroko spoke with the director of the New York Philharmonic, her hands moving expressively as she described something about the acoustics of the hall. Finally, the crowd began to thin. Hiroko's manager, a sharp-eyed woman from the Vienna agency, was beginning to usher out the remaining visitors, mentioning the late hour and tomorrow's commitments. Viktor knew it was now or never. He stepped forward just as Hiroko was gathering her things, ready to leave. "Miss Tanaka," he said, his voice softer than usual. She turned, recognition lighting her eyes. "Mr. Kozlov, you came to my concert." "I did," he nodded. "It was..." He searched for the right word, one that wouldn't sound like the standard platitudes she must have heard dozens of times tonight. "It was necessary," he said finally. Her head tilted slightly, questioning. "For me," he clarified. "I needed to hear music like that again." Understanding dawned in her eyes. She turned to her manager. "Could you give us a few minutes, please?" The manager glanced between them, clearly recognizing Viktor. "Of course. I'll be just outside when you're ready for the car." When they were alone, Hiroko gestured to two chairs in the corner of the room. "Please sit." They sat facing each other, an unusual moment of quiet in the typically bustling backstage area. Viktor noticed that Hiroko looked tired now that the performance energy had faded, the dark circles under her eyes visible despite her careful makeup. "The touring life is not easy, is it?" he said, gesturing vaguely to her appearance. She smiled, ruefully. "No, but I can't complain. So many would give anything for this opportunity." "Yes, but that doesn't make the physical toll any less real." He knew all too well the drain of constant travel, different time zones, strange hotel rooms, the pressure to deliver perfection night after night. "My teacher calls it the price of the gift," Hiroko said. "He says, if music comes to us more easily than to others, we have a responsibility to share it even when it's difficult." Viktor nodded slowly. "Your teacher is a wise man." "Yes," she agreed simply. Then, with gentle directness, "Why was my concert necessary for you, Mr. Kozlov?" The question caught him off guard, though he should have expected it. He looked down at his hands, the long fingers that had earned him millions of dollars, international acclaim, a life of privilege. "I've forgotten something," he said finally. "Something important." Hiroko waited, not filling the silence. "When I heard you in Vienna," he continued, "and again tonight, you play as if the music matters. Not the career, not the acclaim, but the music itself." He looked up at her. "I used to play that way, a long time ago. "What happened?" she asked, her voice free of judgment. Victor gave a small, bitter laugh. Success, competitions, critics, recordings. Gradually, it became about being the best, not about the music. He spread his hands. And I was the best. Technically, but somewhere along the way. "You lost the joy," she finished for him. "Yes." The admission felt both painful and freeing. "Watching your face when you play that Japanese lullaby as an encore, you looked like a child discovering music for the first time." Hiroko smiled, a genuine, warm smile that transformed her serious face. "That song is special to me. My grandmother taught it to me before I could read music. She would sing and I would find the notes on her old piano." "That's it," Victor said, leaning forward. "That connection, that love. I've lost it." He ran, a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration. "My next concert is tomorrow in Chicago. It will be technically perfect. The audience will applaud. The critics will write their usual praise. And I will feel nothing." Hiroko considered him for a long moment. "May I ask you something, Mr. Kozlov?" "Victor, please, and yes." "Victor," she amended, "when was the last time you played just for yourself? Not practicing for a concert, not working on technique, just playing for the joy of it?" He tried to remember. Before the last tour? Before the recording sessions? Before the Grammy nomination? Each milestone had blended into the next, a relentless march forward with no time for reflection. "I don't know," he admitted. "Years, maybe." Hiroko nodded as if his answer confirmed something. "My teacher has a rule. Every day, before any practice begins, I must play something just for myself, something I love with no one listening, no one judging. And that helps. It reminds me why I play. It's easy to forget with all of this." She gestured around them at the trappings of success. Victor was quiet, absorbing her words. Such a simple idea, yet he had never considered it. His practice sessions were rigorous, methodical, designed to maintain and perfect his technique, not to nurture his love of music. "Tomorrow," Hiroko continued, "before your concert, find 10 minutes. Close the door, turn off your phone, play something you loved as a child, something that made you want to become a pianist in the first place, and that will fix everything?" There was a touch of his old skepticism in the question. Hiroko shook her head. "No, but it might be a beginning." The simplicity of her advice struck him. No grand gestures, no dramatic changes, just a small daily act of remembrance and love. "Thank you," he said, meaning it more deeply than he had thanked anyone in years. She looked at her watch. "I should go. Early flight tomorrow." "Where to?" "Boston, then Philadelphia, then Toronto." She smiled tiredly. "The same circuit you know so well." They stood, and Victor felt an unexpected reluctance to end their conversation. "Will our paths cross again?" he asked. "I think they might," Hiroko replied. "We're playing at the same festival in Salzburg next month. I'll look for your name on the program," he said. As they walked toward the door, Victor found himself asking, "Would you consider having dinner with me in Salzburg? I'd like to hear more about your teacher's philosophy." Hiroko looked surprised, then pleased. "I would like that." They reached the door and Victor extended his hand. Hiroko took it, her grip firm despite the evening's exertions. "Play something for yourself tomorrow," she reminded him. "I will," he promised. 3 weeks later, Victor sat in his hotel room in Salzburg, a cup of coffee cooling on the table beside him. Outside, the Austrian city was just waking up, the morning mist still clinging to the mountains surrounding the historic center. On his lap was a worn book of Chopin preludes, the same edition he had used as a child. Following Hiroko's advice, he had begun each day by playing just for himself. At first it had felt awkward, even foolish, but gradually something had shifted. Last night he had performed Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto with the Vienna Philharmonic as part of the Salzburg Festival. Critics would later call it a revelation and Kozlov reborn, noting a new depth, of emotion in his playing. But what mattered more to Victor was how it had felt. For the first time in years, he had lost himself in the music, experiencing that transcendent connection that had made him fall in love with the piano as a child. Tonight, Hiroko would perform Schumann's piano concerto with the same orchestra. Victor had tickets in the front row, and after, they would have dinner, their third such meeting since New York. These conversations had become precious to him, opportunities to rediscover his love of music through her clear-eyed perspective. His phone chimed with a message. It was from Hiroko. "Remember to play for yourself this morning." He smiled and set the phone down, turning to the piano in his suite. He opened the Chopin to the Prelude in E minor, the first piece he had ever memorized as a child. As his fingers touched the keys, he felt that spark of joy, the pure pleasure of creating beauty for its own sake. The famous pianist's smirk, once his trademark, had been replaced by something far more valuable, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and reflected the rediscovered joy in his heart. He owed this transformation to an unassuming Japanese woman whose playing had reminded him of music's true purpose. As the simple, haunting melody of the prelude filled his room, Victor Kozlov played not for critics or audiences or posterity, but for the pure love of the notes under his fingers. In doing so, he found his way back to the path he had strayed from long ago, the path where music was not a competition to be won or a technical challenge to be mastered, but a profound expression of what it means to be human. And somewhere in another hotel room in Salzburg, Hiroko Tanaka was doing the same, honoring the gift they shared and the universal language that had brought them together.